Hi, my name is Pamela Coons, Associate Professor of Medicine in the Division of Oncology at Yale School of Medicine and Yale Cancer Center. I'm excited to announce ASCO's new open access journal, JCO Oncology Advances. As the inaugural editor-in-chief, I hope to support JCO Oncology Advances to become the premier platform to bridge the gap between accessible scientific research and clinical care. Stay tuned for more information, including new article types, at ascopubs.org/JCO Oncology Advances. We look forward to seeing your submissions in spring of 2024.
Hi, I'm Pat Loehrer, Director of Global Oncology and Health Equity at Indiana University, and I'm here with Dave Johnson, a medical oncologist at the University of Texas Southwestern in Dallas, Texas. This is the second half of our two-part oncology, etc. conversation featuring Paul Goldberg, who's the editor of the prestigious oncology publication, The Cancer Letter. While part one focused more closely on Mr. Goldberg's early life, his introduction to writing in oncology, and his work with The Cancer Letter, in part two, we're going to learn more about the literary works of Mr. Goldberg, which are developed outside of The Cancer Letter. We'll also learn about his insight into the Russian Ukrainian conflict. We'll pick the conversation back up with Dave asking Paul about the most important changes he's seen in oncology throughout his career.
What changes in oncology have you seen that have been most impressive in your mind? Apart from therapeutic advances, what other changes have taken place that you've witnessed in your role as editor of Cancer Letter that you think really have made a difference?
I think there's a lot less of this kind of I have more friends now than I've ever had before. Maybe I'm just getting old. And I like a lot of people. There were a lot of people I did not like early on. It's kind of, for me, culturally, that's a difference. I think a lot of people are thinking along the same lines. There's a language of oncology. There's kind of an understanding of the importance of clinical trials. People aren't arguing about whether to randomize. It wasn't that long ago that people were wondering about whether that's even a good thing. And a lot of it, you mentioned Rick Pazura. I don't know if it rises to the level of being able to say I coined the term, but the language of oncology to some extent is Pazurese, because he has gotten everybody on the same wavelength, and people do understand what it takes to get a drug developed most of the time. So that would be my first observation. There's less to argue about the fundamentals, and also a lot of the kids I came up with are now cancer center directors.
Yeah, one of the friendships I think that's been really strong has been you and Otis Brawley.
It was crucial.
You guys wrote a book together, and I think part of that book, which was very interesting, was the title says, "First, do no harm." There's a lot of things we do in medicine that we think we're doing well, but yet by over-testing, over-treatment, we actually don't, in the long run, help the patients or help society. But so tell me a little bit about that, if you will. You're now working on this project with Otis on the history of oncology. And so the perspective of that, and what are some of the most interesting historical stories that you know about?
I think he just at one point at one of the NCI meetings, might have had something to do with NSABP, he started explaining to me the NIH Reauthorization Act of 1993 and how women and minorities language was kind of bizarre in there, and the definition of minorities and definition of race. So here's this guy who's explaining stuff to me, which I wouldn't have really slowed down to think about, because journalists generally don't slow down to think about things unless you tell them to. At least I didn't at the time. And then I said, wow, this guy's been explaining stuff to me, and I've been explaining stuff to him occasionally. So it's been going on. We've been talking probably, give or take once a day for 30 years or so. So, and then that produced the book. And the book was really funny. The first book we did, we were both wondering, where do we begin? And then I said, well, why don't we just begin with the automastectomy, the spontaneous mastectomy that a patient of his at Emory has. And he said, yeah, let's do that. So it was like I knew his story with which to begin. It was that kind of weird, but it was kind of fun.
Whose idea was the book? Was it yours or his, or was it a joint decision?
We had been talking about it for maybe 20 years prior. And then at one point, it was very obvious because my agent even said, I think you're a friend and you should write a book. I think the time is now. That I called Otis that day, but that's not rare occasion. And they said that it is the time to write the book. And Otis said, yeah, it's time to write the book. So we decided that we would do it.
After 20 years, you jumped on it, huh?
Yeah, it's exactly like that.
So, Paul, this is a silly question perhaps, but do you actually write or do you dictate?
Oh, I write.
Or do you manually write or do you type?
Yes, I type. Absolutely. On the computer, absolutely.
What do you do, Dave?
I actually write. I'm not a typist. I do the two-finger thing,
Yeah, I write out and then I'll type, but I write with a pencil.
Yeah, that's what I do as well. That's real old-fashioned.
The young people I work with think it's pretty hilarious that I don't type correctly, but that's just not my bottleneck. My bottleneck is the thinking. It's not the typing. So I'd never really learned to type properly.
So you've written a wide array of different subjects. I mean, as Pat pointed out at the beginning, you've written some fiction, some very successful books, it seems. I came across something that you wrote on the internet I thought was kind of interesting, and I knew nothing about it, but you wrote a piece entitled Why Every Progressive Should Read The Good Soldier Spake.
Oh, yeah, that is me.
I had no idea about The Good Soldier Spake. Maybe you could tell us about this.
Yeah, it's kind of the fundamentals of Eastern European humor. It's also the fundamentals of all humor. It's also fundamentals of, I would have to say, Catch-22 is really impossible without Schweik. It's basically a loosely structured novel. It's set in Prague. Schweik is the Czech national hero of sorts, kind of the Don Quixote of Prague, especially Prague. And it's he tells old stories of, what it really comes down to is he is conscripted into World War I. And he either is a complete idiot or he pretends to be a complete idiot. And that makes him a very sane person in many ways. So it's kind of like only a madman could survive this. But what the beauty of this is, we've never really learned if he's really an idiot. It's actually, he does say this, I have the honor to report that I'm a complete idiot. So his adventures are absolutely hilarious. And before he is conscripted, he catches dogs and sells them, and just takes a mongrel dog and turns it into a terrier by painting it black and chopping off half of his tail, that kind of stuff. So my mother started reading it to me, preparing me for life in the Soviet Union before there was a chance to get out. So my first reading of Schweik, it was totally age inappropriate and politically somewhat inappropriate. It's not an illegal sort of book. It's allowed, which is sort of the joke in and of itself, because in a totalitarian state, a book like Schweik has bred more dissent than Pushkin, who is also allowed. So.
Well, let me ask you this, Paul, just because you brought it up and bring it more timely to what's going on now. Give us a little insight of what you think mothers and children are talking about, not only in Ukraine, but also in Russia right now with this invasion that's going on. What are some of your thoughts? What are your concerns? Whatever, just ruminate a little bit about this, if you don't mind.
I keep thinking about 1968 in Moscow, in August 68, when Soviet tanks rolled into Czechoslovakia. I was 9 years old. But boy, did I just sat there and listened. I was glued to the radio, basically, listening to the Voice of America and others. But I didn't know a single person who really supported it. It's this deep feeling of shame. And there's no way to hide it from anybody, children or whoever, which is also, right at that time. Actually, my mother was reading Schweik to me, which very appropriate book for 68. I think she started before that. But here is an independent state, and our leadership has decided to send tanks. Holy. I can tell you that in 1969, during the hockey championship, I rooted for the Czechs so much. I mean, the Czechs were us. They weren't them. Americans were us too. As far I was rooting for Americans, but the Soviets beat us. But when the Czechs won against the Russians, that was the happiest day of my life, and I was like not quite 9. So it's an incredible feeling of shame, and we all grew up with it. And right now there are children all over Russia who are growing up with it. I don't know anybody who voted for Putin. I know a lot of people in Russia. Nobody I know. Maybe I don't think I ever even ran into anybody like that. It's just not us, it's them. So I guess I might as well just sort of, I grew up among the Moscow intelligentsia. So if I grew up in a small provincial town, maybe definitely the feeling would be very different. The provinces over. So it's also like I'm listening to Zelensky speak in Russian to the Russian people. His Russian is so much better than Putin's because Zelensky has read many books and Putin may have read one that was written under his name, This is the fat-faced idiots of the new Politburo, not the Politburo, of the new kleptocracy. It's really shameful, really shameful. There's no difference really that I know of between my friends there and my friends here of any age. I actually, as part of my historical stuff, I met 2 of the participants in the demonstration on Red Square in 1968, and I knew them fairly well. So I actually just very recently, it's my audio archive of interviews with Soviet dissidents of that time. So I didn't really deliberately put together that archive. I put it together to write a book. But there it was and still is. But yeah, it hasn't changed from 1968. It's just there are more people, more outraged, and it's not going to go well for anybody. But Putin is one of the people for whom it's not going to go well because Ukraine, you might be able to take Kiev, but you're not going to be able to hold Ukraine. No way. No way. These people are, they're my brothers culturally.
You wrote a book entitled The Yid.
Yeah.
Tell us about that. Is that from this experience that you had?
Slightly different. I have just finished the book that's from that experience. That's the one I've just turned in. It's called The Dissident, and that's coming out next year. But The Yid was an interesting project for me. I was a kid in Moscow hanging out with my grandfather and his various friends and my own friends. And they all spoke Yiddish, but they were all Red Army veterans. So there'd be these old Jewish guys walking around with my grandfather and talking about what happened in 1943, telling stories like, well, I took 2 machine gunners and then we went through the swamp for 3 days. And then we found ourselves in the center of Leningrad. That kind of stuff. And it was just truly amazing. So I started thinking of a way of imagining something that Stalin actually did plan to do, which was deport all Jews. It was a kind of a Holocaust that he was planning of his own. And I thought, well, what would these guys have done? So I wrote a comedy about Stalin's death. It begins with KGB, NKVD, trying to arrest an old Jewish actor. My grandfather was a pharmacist. He was not an actor. But it did give that guy our apartment, our communal flat in the center of Moscow. So he kind of got arrested in my place. But the problem is that the arrest doesn't take place the way they usually do take place. This guy kills 3 NKVD.
The protagonist is a hero. He does almost a Spider-Man-like activity.
Yeah. Small swords number, which he develops on stage. So, and then I actually also weirdly, I was very lucky in that my part of my material is my aunt comes from a very famous Jewish intelligentsia family. And in fact, her grandfather started the Moscow Hebrew Theater, which became now the National Theater of Israel. He was sort of very major ethnomusicologist. Her maiden name is Dobrushina, and that was one of the Moscow Yiddish Theater playwrights. So I was able to kind of hear the stories of, my aunt telling me the stories about having seen Solomon Michoels and after his trip to America. legendary things. And I put it all together into this novel, imagining kind of an alternative history. But really, Stalin did die when Stalin died. It's just that I changed the mechanism of his death. And it's a comedy, so it's kind of a Yiddish comedy.
You also wrote a book entitled The Chateau, but this was a more contemporary, I think, right? What was the inspiration for that book, which takes place in Florida, right?
Right. It was my stab at Florida realism. It began with, it's actually what I did was, the characters are all fictional. The protagonist is a journalist in Washington at the Washington Post, a little bit of a nebbish, not a little bit, very much a nebbish, gets fired for insubordination at the Washington Post, then goes over to try to write a book kind of about his college roommate who dies mysteriously. So it's kind of a murder mystery. It's kind of Florida realism for the most part. And it's kind of a kleptocracy story about condo board, which really is America at the time. And the time frame is right before Trump's inauguration. So it's like Trump supporting Soviet Jews. There's the sort of a din of here it comes. And it was an interesting book to write. I don't think I ever want to write a current, and I'll write a nonfiction book, but I don't want to really write any more about something that happens now. My model for that was Turgenev. It was Fathers and Sons. So I planted it in Florida, kind of played on my fantasy of what it would be like if my father were not anything like my father actually is.
Before we wind up, can I ask you a quick question too? Comes from one of our viewers or one of our listeners. I remember when I was first dating, would get really sweaty and nervous just calling up, would eventually turned out to be my wife. I would get that same feeling years later when I was calling a babysitter to see if she would go and take care of our kids. But the third point of terror is being interviewed by you and the cancer letter. And you would get sweaty palms and getting really nervous. What advice would you have for someone who's being interviewed?
I'm not a ferocious person. I just ask questions like you just did. It's very strange, but I wouldn't even know how to be anything but polite. Well, there are situations where you probably wouldn't want to take my calls, but you know what those situations are. So it's completely sort of like not an issue. I have more friends than I have enemies by a factor of maybe 1,000. It's really true. I don't think I've ever screwed up in that way of just going after. This was the one case where I really screwed up, but this was very early. This would have been very early in my career. And now I would have just figured it out very quickly and said, oh, what the hell was I doing? But no, I mean, I have so much respect for the people who do this work, for both of you. I have so much respect for people who serve on ODAC or on CAB or President's Cancer Panel and any of these incredible groups. I have so much respect for the cooperative group system, for the methodology of clinical trials. I mean, you start messing with the methodology of clinical trials, yeah, you're gonna get me on. It wouldn't be pleasant, but you would know you're doing it.
I think we all agree that you've done a wonderful job of helping our field advance in so many ways and uncovering some things that aren't so good and helping us correct those mistakes. And I personally want to thank you for that. I know Pat feels the same way.
Thank you. I think I get entirely too much credit for the cancer letter. It's not really been just me for a very long time. Right now, we have also the Cancer History Project, and my co-editor on that is Otis Brawley. Then the cancer letter operations are run by Katie Goldberg, who also happens to be my daughter, but she is also the illustrator. Katie is the adult supervision really for all of the operations, and she's working with Mona Mirmurtazavi, who's also very, very talented. And then my editorial side, there's Matt Ong, who's been here for 8 years, and he knows his way around oncology. Many people have dealt with him on many stories. And then there's Alice Tracy, who is an engineer, also a writer by training, and she is just a journalist of incredible talent. And then there is, of course, Alex Carolyn, who is working with the Cancer History Project. She's the staff for it. And then, of course, the web designer, David Coe, and the graphics designer, Jackie Ong. And it's a big crew. It takes a lot to produce the cancer letter, and it's also really a blast.
One final question for you. We've asked all of our guests, and we've talked a lot about your writings and your books, but have you read something recently that you could recommend to our listeners, or perhaps a documentary that you've seen that you think is worthy of our time? What would you recommend to us and to our listeners?
Well, I'm just going to reach for a book that's sitting in front of me right now. The Man Who Sold America. It's a story of Albert Lasker and the creation of the advertising century. It's very interesting because one of his creations was Mary Lasker, who created the National Cancer, and took her a while to figure it out, but he taught her. He was long gone by the time this was done, but without him and the mirrors that were erected, and he taught her how to erect those mirrors and how to make it happen. And it's kind of a story of lies, but then, human genius gets in there. The methodology gets put together. Everything starts happening, I mean, like when they got started in this field, and this is not the book, but everybody had a monoclonal antibody, and everybody was laughing at people who had monoclonal antibodies. Immunology, yeah, right. Whom has Steve Rosenberg ever cured? Human genius stepped in.
I just clicked on Amazon to have it sent to me. I should be here by tomorrow afternoon.
It's an interesting book about a guy with, bipolar disorder who does a bunch of weird and brilliant things.
Paul, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. It's been a real blast, this opportunity to chat with you.
Well, thank you. And I'm sorry if I was being nonlinear.
No, we appreciate your nonlinearity. Let me take the moment now and thank our listeners for tuning in to Oncology, etc. This is an ASCO educational podcast where we will talk about anything and everything. So if you have a suggestion for a guest you would like us to interview, please send your suggestion to education@asco.org. Thanks again. And remember, Pat is not a Russian dissident.
Thanks, Paul. It's been terrific having you. Dave, not so much.
Thank you for listening to the ASCO Education Podcast. To stay up to date with the latest episodes, please click subscribe. Let us know what you think by leaving a review. For more information, visit the Comprehensive Education Center at education.asco.org.
The purpose of this podcast is to educate and to inform. This is not a substitute for professional medical care and is not intended for use in the diagnosis or treatment of individual conditions. Guests on this podcast express their own opinions, experience, and conclusions. Guest statements on the podcast do not express the opinions of ASCO. The mention of any product, service, organization, activity, or therapy should not be construed as an ASCO endorsement.